Hola, hola, bienvenidos. Creo que está ya conectado Diego Garazzi, que va a ser nuestro moderador, coordinador. Teníamos algunos problemas técnicos en su computadora. Diego, ¿me estás escuchando?
Sí, yo te estoy escuchando, Andrés. ¿A mí?
Perfecto, buenísimo. Sí, se te escucha bien. Ahora si prendés tu cámara, a ver si te podemos dejar la conducción de este espacio, de esta sesión, donde vamos a tratar el valor de los contenidos en Internet con las lecciones del modelo australiano. ¿Podés prender tu cámara?
Me dice que el hospedador me detuvo la cámara, así que supongo que depende de vos.
Ahí está. Bueno, vamos a solucionarlo.
Ahí estoy. A ver.
Buenísimo, buenísimo. Bueno, genial. Perdonen la desprolijidad técnica, pero hasta minutos antes de comenzar teníamos este problema técnico. Ya estamos en línea, Diego, así que nada, te escuchamos y vamos a aprender en esta sesión, la última del día, de las jornadas en el marco de la Junta de Directores de Adepa. Adelante.
Bueno, gracias. Voy a compartir pantalla, así que seguramente se va a eliminar esta. En un segundito. Por favor. Vamos por aquí. Ahí está.
Perdón, Diego, antes que comiences,
Sí.
discúlpame que te interrumpa, les comentamos a los participantes que abajo pueden encontrar el icono de interpretación, ¿sí? Y pueden elegir entre los idiomas, obviamente el idioma original en castellano o en inglés, pueden switchar entre los dos, así que ahí mismo abajo pueden elegir el canal de audio que prefieran. Esta primera parte tuya va a ser en castellano, por supuesto, y después la intervención de David en inglés. Gracias.
Perfecto. ¿Me escuchan bien, Andrés?
Perfecto, Diego.
Bueno, bárbaro. Bueno, muchas gracias. Esto voy a ser muy breve, tratar de ser muy breve. Es un tema absolutamente actual y apasionante fundamentalmente para los medios de comunicación. Y la brevedad que voy a tratar de imponerle a esta muy sintética presentación es porque queremos escuchar a David, a quien después presentaremos, David Abkiewicz, porque trae las novedades de algo concreto que sucedió en Australia, con lo cual es muy interesante para nosotros. Antes de entrar a la presentación, esto es algo que incorporé, disculpen la informalidad si se quiere, pero esto es algo que incorporé recién hoy, porque estuve leyendo así esta noticia, y ustedes fíjense qué interesante lo siguiente. Es una noticia del diario La Nación, en donde dice que Paul McCartney, Noel Gallagher y Kate Bush encabezaron un reclamo a las plataformas de streaming por las ganancias de los artistas. Bueno, ¿qué significa esto? Que todas las industrias están enfocando hacia el mismo lado. Hay un consenso entre todas las industrias de que las plataformas están de alguna manera abusando de una posición de dominio, aprovechándose y beneficiándose de los contenidos, de los creadores de contenidos, y todas las industrias están de alguna manera empezando, algunas con más tiempo que otras, a despabilarse y a reclamar lo que consideran que les corresponde. Rápidamente, esta presentación de hoy es una continuación de algunas presentaciones que dimos el año pasado. Y en las charlas del año pasado fuimos bastante más meticulosos en meternos en cada uno de los motivos que originan los reclamos de los medios a las plataformas. Plataformas, para que tengan la idea gráfico, para que sepan hacer una idea, son fundamentalmente Google y Facebook, pero en esas dos incorporamos al resto. Yo lo que quiero hacer con esta presentación, que originalmente o pretendía ser la imagen de un oso, porque el efecto que tienen las plataformas es como el abrazo del oso. Es ese abrazo que al principio es afable, es ameno, es agradable, pero de golpe uno va sintiendo que lo va apretando y termina asfixiado. Bueno, no encontré un oso de 8 patas, así que bueno, me me arreglé con la imagen de un pulpo. Pero estos 8 motivos, vamos, como decía que esto es una continuación de las anteriores, vamos a puntualizar en estas 4 que están destacadas en Colorado. Las plataformas son gatekeepers del acceso a Internet, es decir, son fundamentales, ya no hay discusión de que los medios de comunicación no pueden no estar en Internet, no pueden no acceder a través de las plataformas. ¿Por qué? Porque las plataformas tienen un monopolio muy marcado en la dinámica de la navegación en Internet. En el caso de Argentina, el 94% de los usuarios accede a través de Google a los contenidos que pretenden. El segundo importante es el concepto de free riding. Las plataformas se benefician económicamente y directamente, y también de manera indirecta, del contenido que difunden, del contenido producido por los medios de comunicación en este caso, que difunden a través de sus canales y de sus plataformas justamente, o de sus productos. Tienen una posición de dominio, una posición dominante en la distribución del contenido, lo que decíamos antes de ser los gatekeepers del acceso a Internet, y en la comercialización de la publicidad digital. Esto llevaría otra presentación, la de la publicidad digital y cómo dominan esa materia las plataformas, cómo concentran en esas plataformas la gran mayoría de la publicidad digital, tirando o echando los precios hacia abajo de la publicidad que los medios podrían comercializar de otra manera o de manera directa. Fundamentalmente, uno de los puntos centrales es el desarrollo de servicios y contrataciones, y desarrollo de servicios y productos por parte de estas plataformas que hacen que todas los medios y todos los clientes de Internet se vean de alguna manera obligados a contratar todos esos productos y servicios que desarrollan las plataformas. Es lo que se llama en temas de defensa de la competencia, es lo que se llama una integración vertical. Las plataformas van adquiriendo servicios y van desarrollando otros servicios, van adquiriendo empresas que tienen desarrollados productos y servicios que intermedian, en el caso, por ejemplo, de la publicidad, entre los proveedores de publicidad o espacios de publicidad y entre los anunciantes, que son los que demandan esa publicidad. Todos los servicios y sistemas que están en el medio de esa oferta y demanda son producidos o son adquiridos por las plataformas, fundamentalmente Google y Facebook, obligando de alguna manera en este caso, los medios de comunicación a contratar todos esos servicios. Vamos a apurar. El foco de esta presentación es, o lo que queremos transmitirle es un avance de lo que vimos el año pasado, y es qué está pasando hoy en el mundo. Y en el mundo hay 3 ejes fundamentales a través de los cuales los países y los grupos de medios están trabajando para lograr el objetivo final, que es una valoración correcta y justa del contenido que producen los medios y que las plataformas difunden y se aprovechan. El primer, uno de los ejes es el judicial. Hay una ley en Europa de derechos de autor y hay leyes en todos los países de defensa de la competencia. Bueno, allí hay un pilar importante donde los medios de comunicación y los gobiernos están trabajando para ver la forma de afectar o la forma de compensar y de trabajar con las plataformas. El otro eje principal es la nueva legislación. Dijimos que en Europa ya teníamos una legislación, la disposición de marzo de 2019 de derechos de autor, pero esa legislación en Europa requiere que todos los países vayan bajando a leyes locales las disposiciones de esa norma. Bueno, en otros países, como fundamentalmente en América Latina, se está trabajando fuertemente en una legislación que obligue a las plataformas a pagar por el contenido del cual se aprovechan y el cual difunden y al cual le agregan valor. Esto es indiscutible, pero tiene que ser un aprovechamiento justo y un pago justo. Y la última, el último de los ejes, es la negociación privada, es decir, los medios de comunicación como empresas privadas y las plataformas como empresas privadas entablan una negociación para alcanzar ese precio que consideren eventualmente justo o inicialmente aceptable. ¿Qué está pasando en Australia? Lo voy a dejar a David más adelante, en unos minutos, que es el experto y es quien ha trabajado directamente en la gestación de este código del News Media Platforms Mandatory Bargaining Code. Es decir, un código que de alguna manera impulsa la negociación entre las partes. Y él lo va a poder explicar mejor. Y es muy interesante y en todo caso después, si hay algo de esto de Australia que a mí me quede en el tintero, lo comento. Pero es muy, muy interesante lo sucedido en Australia, porque aparte es un hecho concreto. Hay un código que obliga a las partes a determinadas situaciones. Bueno, lo vamos a hablar con David. Para que tengan un pantallazo general de otros países, en Alemania hay un mix de esos tres ejes. Por un lado, hay muchos medios de comunicación, más bien menores, si se quiere, o no tan importantes, pero mucha cantidad de medios que han logrado o han alcanzado un acuerdo fundamentalmente con Google y con Facebook y han logrado firmar acuerdos de pago por el contenido. Pero es muy interesante que el grupo, uno de los grupos más importantes de toda Europa y el más importante de Alemania, que es el grupo Axel Springer, no ha firmado ningún acuerdo y se opone a la firma de estos acuerdos porque consideran que es muy negativo el aprovechamiento que hacen las plataformas de una situación económica y financiera difícil por la que están atravesando los medios, ofreciendo sumas inapropiadamente bajas, dice Axel Springer. Y el otro punto muy interesante, que tiene que ver con el otro eje, que es el de la legislación, la empresa, Axel Springer, dice que cuenta con un derecho de autor europeo que permite de forma transparente a todos los editores participar de una remuneración adecuada. En Alemania es como que se mezclan las dos situaciones, o los dos de los tres ejes que comentábamos. El eje judicial, o el eje legislativo y el eje de acuerdo entre las partes, el eje negocial. En Francia, originalmente, la autoridad de la competencia francesa aplicó a Google en diciembre de 2019 una multa de 150 millones de euros. Acá vemos, si bien no es una judicialización formal, pero la autoridad de competencia tiene de alguna manera funciones judiciales o de autoridad, y en el año 2019 sancionó a Google por 150 millones de euros por lo opaco de sus motores de búsqueda o de los famosos algoritmos, la poca transparencia y por reglas discriminatorias. En octubre de 2020, el Tribunal de París falló a favor de la autoridad frente a la apelación que había hecho Google en su momento y confirmó esta resolución, obligando a negociar con los editores de prensa el costo de los derechos conexos, así lo llaman en Francia, a los contenidos de los medios de prensa. Y en el transcurso del año 2020 y 2021, Google ha anunciado la firma de acuerdos comerciales con varios editores de prensa de primer orden, entre ellos el diario Le Monde, Courrier International, L'Observateur, Le Figaro. Bueno, ustedes los conocen, la mayoría son muy conocidos medios de comunicación, originalmente gráficos de manera fundamental, en Francia. Esto también vemos cómo toma dos ejes de los tres que mencionábamos, el eje judicial originalmente y el eje negocial en estos meses. En Estados Unidos el foco está puesto más que nada en este concepto de integración vertical. de Google y de Facebook, que afecta decididamente al mercado. En el caso de Google, de buscadores, y de redes sociales y mensajería a Facebook, con Instagram y WhatsApp fundamentalmente. Y la publicidad digital. Hay un enfoque predominantemente legislativo, pero no tanto en lo que tiene que ver con derechos de autor, si bien están avanzando también en ese orden, pero fundamentalmente en lo que es defensa de la competencia. Ejes que hagan una transparencia, una competencia más transparente y más clara. De hecho, como todos deben saber, hay mucha presión para que estas dos empresas, Google y Facebook, de alguna manera se desprendan de ciertos activos y de ciertas empresas que han adquirido, y para poder hacer una competencia más abierta y transparente. En Canadá, muy breve y ya termino, es muy interesante lo que está sucediendo. Allí el eje se centra en lo legislativo. Está discutiendo una ley para modificar la ley de derechos de autor, con la finalidad de otorgar a las organizaciones periodísticas el derecho a una remuneración por la distribución a través de las plataformas del contenido que generan. Pero lo más interesante en el caso de Canadá es que propone modificar la ley para que esta remuneración sea gestionada por una sociedad colectiva. Es decir, la idea en Canadá, que es una idea que está también en otros países, pero que está muy avanzado en Canadá, es que haya una asociación, una sociedad colectiva, como por ejemplo todos deben conocer o habrán escuchado SADAIC, que gestiona los derechos colectivos de los autores de música o de los músicos, y de esta manera, a través de una sociedad colectiva, gestionar de manera, veremos cómo, el pago por los contenidos para todos los medios. Esto es algo, un avance distinto en este caso. Y para terminar, el caso de América Latina, hay dos casos algo distintos en Brasil y en Argentina. En el caso de Brasil y en Argentina, los dos, Google ha trabajado con un proyecto que lo habrán visto seguramente, que es Showcase, el cual en Brasil ha sucedido algo parecido a lo que sucedió en Alemania. Varios medios brasileños han firmado acuerdos con Google por este producto Showcase, en el cual los contenidos de los medios son licenciados a Google para que los proyecte y los difunda a través de ese producto Showcase, y a cambio Google paga un importe. Pero hay un grupo de medios muy importante en Brasil que se ha negado a firmar esos acuerdos y está insistiendo por la vía judicial. En Argentina, los dos ejes principales son el eje negocial, en donde muchos medios han suscrito acuerdos con Google por la licencia de cierto contenido para ser difundido a través de Showcase, pero también está en análisis muy fuertemente y en pleno desarrollo una norma, una ley que obliga a las plataformas a pagar una retribución justa a los medios de comunicación que producen el contenido del cual se valen las plataformas. Yo con esto termino, espero haber sido claro, breve, disculpen si es un poco acelerado el ritmo, pero quiero darle paso a David Abkiewicz, que es director de la división Plataformas Digitales de la Comisión Australiana de Competencia y Consumidores, donde dirigió el trabajo sobre el código de negociación de los medios de comunicación, que es el que comenté recién, y trabajó en la investigación de la actividad desarrollada por plataformas digitales, su relación con los contenidos informativos producidos por los medios de comunicación y el beneficio que las plataformas obtienen de la utilización y difusión de tales contenidos a través de sus redes y canales de difusión. Antes de unirse a la Comisión de Competencia, Comisión Australiana de Competencia y Consumidores, David trabajó también en políticas de medios y telecomunicaciones en el Departamento de Finanzas y el Departamento de Comunicaciones del Gobierno de Australia, con lo cual, a través de la proyección, a través de la presentación de David, vamos a poder ver a alguien y escuchar a alguien que ha estado de los dos lados del mostrador y que tiene un conocimiento vasto sobre este tema. David, te cedo la palabra, muchas gracias a todos, y después, bueno, las preguntas que tengan las vamos a ir viendo en el chat y las comentaremos más adelante. Adelante. Gracias.
Diego, perdón, ¿podés dejar de compartir tu pantalla? Gracias.
Claro.
Thanks very much, Andres and Diego, for that introduction, as well as that really good overview of what's happening around the world in this space. If I could, I think, Diego, you're going to share my presentation. Andres, thanks very much. Great. So hi, everyone. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak to you in my morning and your evening about this policy. As was mentioned, I am a member of the Australian Public Service working in the ACCC, and I'm going to talk you through our digital platforms news media bargaining code policy and project. I'll start off by talking about our digital platforms inquiry, which was the market study that we did that made recommendations leading to this new legislation. I'll talk about a bit about how we developed the code itself, the news media bargaining code, including an outline of the main elements of the code that I think might be of most interest. And then I'll talk about the outcomes of our legislation, which passed earlier this year, and the next steps for the Australian government. If I could flick to the next slide. Thanks. If we could move to the next slide. Oh, I think I might be able to do it. No, sorry. I think. Apologies, Andres, if we could move on to the next one. In the meantime, I'll start talking to the next slide anyway. So I work for the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. Thanks. We are the competition regulator in Australia, the equivalent to Argentina's National Commission for the Defence of Competition. We're part of the Treasury portfolio in Australia. And sorry, if we could go back a bit. Our main role in the Australian government is to maintain and promote competition, including through reviewing mergers and taking enforcement action to address competition concerns. We also look at consumer issues in terms of protecting the interests and safety of consumers. And we undertake market studies and inquiries, such as the Digital Platforms Inquiry and the Digital Platform Services Inquiry, which is the one that we are now doing to follow up on some of the findings and recommendations in that original Digital Platforms Inquiry. We also, as I'm talking about today, worked on the development of the News Media Bargaining Code. This was somewhat unusual for the role of our agency, but given it was based so heavily on a recommendation we had made in the Digital Platforms Inquiry, the government asked us to be heavily involved in the development of this new policy and legislation. And we also worked alongside other government departments, such as the Treasury and the Department of Communications, in developing this policy. Next slide, please. Sorry, if we could move to the next one, thanks.
Sorry, David, what number of the slide?
Oh, so number 4, thanks. I have to apologize. I did try running the slideshow myself, but the Australian internet wasn't good enough for me to have both the slideshow and my video on at the same time. So the process for the digital platforms inquiry was an 18-month inquiry into digital platforms that started in December 2017. The final report was released in July 2019. It might be interesting to hear that the impetus or the origin of this inquiry was following some broader changes that the Australian government had made to media regulation. The government relaxed some of the media ownership and control restrictions that had previously prevented the same people owning a large number of media assets, such as broadcasters. And as part of negotiating those arrangements, the government also agreed with other parliamentarians to conduct this digital platforms inquiry with a large focus on media issues. So it looked both at the market power of Google and Facebook, as well as the supply or the choice and availability of news and journalism online, and how that choice and availability of journalism had been affected by digital platforms, largely the leading players, Google and Facebook. The digital platforms inquiry made 23 recommendations on competition and consumer issues, which spanned from changes in merger law, changes to consumer protection, and increased privacy regulation. But those most relevant to news and journalism was recommendation 6, which recommended this industry code, which I'm talking about, that's designed to address the bargaining power imbalance between digital platforms and news businesses. But this was only one of a number of recommendations we made to address media issues, and it's important to point out that this recommendation wasn't intended to solve the whole issue altogether. It sat alongside other recommendations to support the sustainability of journalism, including increased funding for regional and small news publishers, increasing digital media literacy among the Australian population, both in schools and in the broader community, as well as codes of conduct to combat disinformation and misinformation on digital platforms. So that's the often called the fake news issue. Next slide, please. Go to number 5. So among the key findings of the inquiry was that Facebook and Google as the leading digital platforms, as well as the services they own, so Google owns YouTube, Facebook owns Instagram, as we all know, they've become an indispensable part of daily life for Australians. So to give some context to those figures, Google search is used by 19 million Australians every month, and Australia's population is around 24, 25 million. So these figures show that the vast majority of Australians are using digital platform services very frequently. At the same time, these digital platforms have taken up a lot of the online advertising revenue, and this, as you know, advertising revenue used to be used to support journalism, both in print and online. But now Google and Facebook are taking the lion's share of this revenue. Google takes $53 of every $100 spent on advertising online. Facebook takes $28, leaving only $19 for all other online publishers, which includes news publishers as a small subset of that $19. We also found that at the same time as this advertising revenue was shifting from news publishers to digital platforms, there had been a decline in certain types of journalistic coverage over the last 10 or 15 years. So as you see there, coverage of local government matters had gone down by 20%, coverage of local court down by 40% since 2005, health issues had declined by 30%, and coverage of science in mainstream news has declined by 42%. We found that this demonstrated that news as a public good had the risk to be under-provided due to the lack of or declining funding available through advertising. And these particular types of coverage are among the most expensive to produce, but also among the most relevant and important to democratic decision making. So we had identified that there was a real problem with this type of coverage declining at the same time as revenues were declining. Another big concern for us was the reduction in local news coverage, particularly in suburban, outer metropolitan and regional areas of Australia. So as you know, Australia is quite large geographically, but quite dispersed population-wise. And we found that coverage of local government issues, particularly in regional areas, was declining. And there was 32 local government areas that had been left. I should say this relies on more recent research than ours, but there's now 32 local government areas without any local newspaper, and 16 in regional Australia. This is a big concern because this kind of local coverage is very important in holding local governments to account, as well as informing Australians about democratic decision making at that local level. So that's what in Australia we have local councils charged with the administration of local government services and important to the day-to-day life of Australians. And there's been a lot of research you might have seen in the US and elsewhere that shows that a decline in local coverage can be directly linked to an increase in overspending and less accountability at the local government level. The other major finding of the digital platforms inquiry that was relevant to the news media bargaining code was that, as Diego was describing earlier, Facebook and Google as the leading digital platforms are essentially unavoidable trading partners for news media businesses, as I'm sure you all know. In order to reach audiences online, it's really crucial that your content is available on Facebook and or Google, which makes these two services really important to the business operations of Australian publishers. However, while Facebook and Google do derive a benefit from having news on their services, no one individual publisher is nearly as important to Facebook and Google as Facebook or Google is to each individual publisher. So if that makes sense, this gives rise to a severe bargaining power imbalance between any individual publisher and Facebook and Google. So at the same time as they have to work with the platforms to reach audiences, they don't have a great say in commercial negotiations. And this has led to publishers accepting commercial terms for the use of their content or for the availability of their content that are less favorable than they might otherwise have accepted in the absence of this bargaining power imbalance. So go to the next slide, please. If we could go to number 6. Thanks. So following the digital platforms inquiry's findings that I've just talked through, we made a recommendation that the government should institute an industry code to address the bargaining power imbalance I've described between publishers and each leading platform, Facebook and Google. Industry codes are a fairly common mechanism used in Australia to address bargaining power imbalances among certain industries. We also have industry codes, for example, that regulate the relationship between farmers and dairy producers and grocery stores, as well as a bargaining code that addresses the power imbalance between franchisors and franchisees. So while it's a fairly novel mechanism in other parts of the world, in Australia we're quite used to it, and it's quite a common thing in competition regulation, and a number of these codes are already administered by the ACCC. Following the digital platforms inquiry, the government first asked us to work with the industry, so both publishers and platforms, to implement a voluntary code to address the bargaining power imbalance. That was towards that December 2019. We worked with platforms and publishers over the start of 2020 on this voluntary code, and negotiations were underway. However, in April 2020, as you all know, COVID-19 became a great concern for the world, but also specifically led to a severe drop in advertising revenue available to publishers due to the economic impact of the pandemic, which made the issue of sustainability of journalism all the more urgent in Australia. The government asked us how the voluntary negotiations were going, and we advised that while they had made some progress on a number of issues, they were unlikely to reach agreement on the really crucial issue of payment for content anytime soon. So on the basis of that, the government asked us to accelerate the process and move to developing a mandatory code rather than a voluntary code. And that's now what we've seen. If we could move next slide, please. So the objectives of the code. This is a market-based mechanism as an industry code. It's not intended as a direct tax. It's not intended as a direct transfer of resources. But what it's really intended to encourage is good faith commercial negotiation between platforms and news businesses of the type that might have occurred in the absence of the bargaining power imbalance. So we want to encourage Facebook and Google to work with publishers openly and in good faith to make commercial deals that reflects the benefit that Google and Facebook receive from news, as well as the benefit that publishers already receive from Google and Facebook. We do acknowledge that there is a two-way value exchange here. So every part of the code is intended to incentivize good faith commercial negotiations, whether that's within the bounds of the code or even outside the code, with the code as kind of a mechanism lying in wait to encourage those negotiations. It provides a framework for these negotiations that first encourages voluntary commercial negotiation. Then if those commercial negotiations don't result in a negotiation in time, there is a process for mandatory mediation and, importantly, arbitration, where an independent arbitrator would go and address the dispute between the parties over payment and make a ruling. The other objective of the code is to ensure the sustainability of journalism. While it is a market mechanism and it does so through commercial negotiations, the sustainability of journalism is the real reason why the government is getting involved here. There are similar bargaining power imbalances throughout the economy, and it wouldn't be appropriate for the government to get involved every single time. But given that that public interest journalism is really crucial to the functioning of democracy, the government felt it important to intervene to resolve this particular bargaining power imbalance. Next slide, please. So the first mechanism that is important to understand in the operation of the code is that in order for the code to become active for a particular digital platform, the Australian Treasurer has to designate the code. Designate a particular platform for the purposes of the code. And on slide 8, we've got a bit of information about designation. So when the Treasurer is deciding to bring in a digital platform for the purpose of the code, they will consider whether there is a significant bargaining power imbalance between the platform and the news business, and they'll also consider whether the platform has made a significant contribution to the sustainability of the Australian news industry through agreements with Australian news businesses. So on considering the bargaining power imbalance, the Treasurer will take advice from the ACCC. And on the other element, that's more of a judgment call based on how many deals have already been made with publishers. As Diego was explaining in Germany and Argentina and elsewhere, some publishers are already signing up for these new services such as Google News Showcase, which do to some degree contribute to sustainability, and that's what the Treasurer will consider there. As I will get to, no platforms have yet been designated under the code, which is an important point. So while the code has been legislated, it is at the moment lying in wait until a platform is designated, which has not happened yet. Next slide, please. So on the next slide, we talk about the how an individual news business can register to participate in the code. This was a really interesting area to work on, as well as a very difficult area, because it involved setting criteria by which news media businesses could qualify to participate in the code and have the right to negotiate with Google or Facebook through mandatory negotiations, or whether a particular news business didn't qualify. As you know, it always gets very tricky when governments are making decisions about news content, and you definitely want to have a large separation between the government and editorial content. But at the same time, we needed some sort of registration mechanism to identify which of those professional news businesses that are producing public interest journalism that should qualify for participation in the code. If there were no eligibility criteria, it could be anyone with a blog or a website that tries to sign up and negotiate with Google and Facebook, which would obviously place too large a burden on the platforms and would mean that the policy mechanism was not targeted enough. So on the slide 9, we can see there's a number of registration criteria that a news publisher must meet in order to participate in the code. Thanks. The 4 main tests are set out here. There is a minimum annual revenue threshold. That's to identify which publishers can be considered professional publishers, professional news producers. Although that minimum annual revenue threshold is very low. It's only set at 150,000 Australian dollars per year. Our thinking there was that if you have enough resources to basically employ 1 full-time journalist, you should be able to register for the code. There's professional standards of journalism. So this looks at internal and external editorial policies that your publication signs up for, including, importantly, accountability and dispute resolution mechanisms for complaints from readers. Eligible publications need to have a predominantly Australian audience. So that means you don't need to be an Australian-owned company, and a number of our news businesses in Australia are owned by international companies such as News Corp or The Guardian or the Daily Mail, which are all producing important Australian journalism, even though they're branches of international news companies. But you have to be directing your content to an Australian audience. And most importantly, the type of news content published. This was a really tricky one because we had to look at what type of news content is that public interest journalism that is important for democratic decision making. We didn't want to make value judgments. We didn't want to say coverage of celebrities or entertainment is less important than coverage of politics necessarily. But we did need to identify that kind of journalism, such as local court reporting, such as local government reporting, that is important to democratic decision making, and it also risks being underprovided. So where we landed was a legislative definition of what we call core news, which is another word for public interest journalism. I'm not sure how well this will translate, so apologies for that, but I will read it out anyway. So our definition of core news or public interest journalism that will qualify you for the code is content that reports, investigates, or explains issues or events that are relevant in engaging Australians in public debate and in informing democratic decision-making, or current issues or events of public significance for Australians at a local, regional, or national level. So the two arms of the definition cover off, is this coverage of important cultural or political issues that will inform democratic decision-making or debate, or the second arm, is this important local coverage of what's going on in your local community, or public significance for example, if you're going to vote in a local council election, something like that. We thought it was really important to keep a focus on local publications, because otherwise those are some of the publications that are most at risk in Australia. So the key features of the code, once a news business has registered, what does the code entitle you to? So first and most important is it entitles you to initiate good faith bargaining with designated digital platforms. A registered business, once you're in the code and once a platform is designated, you can approach Google or Facebook if they're designated and say, hi, we would like to start bargaining with you under the code. And that starts a clock that gives you 2 months to negotiate between the parties. If that negotiation doesn't result in a successful agreement within that 2 months, then you can move on to mediation. If that mediation doesn't resolve the issue, there is an arbitration mechanism, which I'll talk about in a second. The code also entitles registered businesses to minimum standards, and these go to some of the concerns about content on digital platforms that don't involve just the question of payment. So the large one in there is that if a designated platform is going to make major changes to the algorithms that rank and sort news content, they just have to provide a certain amount of advance notice. They have to tell registered news businesses 14 days in advance that, hey, there's going to be a change to the algorithms. This is roughly what this will change for you, and it's going to happen on a certain date. There's also minimum standards around the availability of data. It doesn't require digital platforms to hand over any user or consumer data. It just requires them to say, here is the data we collect using your news content, and here are some mechanisms by which we're already making it available in cases where they do already make that data available. One of the things we heard from Google and Facebook and from publishers was that there was a bit of a disconnect. Google and Facebook thought they were already making a lot of data available. A lot of publishers, and particularly some of the less sophisticated publishers in Australia, weren't even aware of how they could get the data that was already available to them. So this was intended to resolve that issue. Given the large scale of the platforms being regulated by the code, it was important that they had appropriately large penalties, which are set at 10% of the Australian annual revenue for the platforms for breaching the main provisions of the code. There's also an important element, that's the non-differentiation provisions. You could think of these as anti-gaming provisions, and what these do is stop a platform from dropping all Australian news content and just relying on international news content in order to avoid the application of the code. Next slide. So if we talk about the final offer arbitration mechanism, if a dispute between parties does go to final offer arbitration, this arbitration is, as you'll see on slide 11, It's a mechanism called final offer arbitration or baseball arbitration. The media regulator in Australia, the ACMA, would appoint a panel of arbitrators who would be independent from government to hold the arbitration. And the two parties, so the platform and the particular news media business, would go to the arbitrators with their best final offer for payment for that publisher's news content. If we could move to the next slide, Andres, thanks. Both parties would submit, as I said, their best offer. They would only have one shot at submitting an offer. So they might say $1 million, the other party might say $10 million. And the arbitrator or the panel of arbitrators would simply choose one offer or the other offer. They wouldn't be able to choose or to set a price in between the two offers. So what this is intended to do is to ensure that the parties both submit the most reasonable offer. Because if you make an ambit claim, if you ask for a price that's too high, or as a platform, if you try and ask for a price that's too low, it's likely that your opposition's offer, the other side's offer, will be more reasonable, and that is the one that will get chosen. It's a mechanism that's used in a number of other regulatory contexts around the world, most notably in Canada. Their Communications and Radio Television Commission, CRTC, uses a very similar mechanism to arbitrate between disputes between cable TV providers and cable TV channel providers. Final offer arbitration is intended to be a bit of a scary mechanism. We would expect that both parties wouldn't want to go to final offer arbitration, but it's really there as a backstop or a forcing mechanism to encourage the parties to come to an agreement in commercial negotiation. If we could move to slide 12. So the commercial negotiations between the parties. As I said, the parties are encouraged to undertake commercial negotiations at any time, and they can do so without even activating the particular mechanisms in the code. In their commercial negotiations, they can agree to turn off the minimum standards, or they can agree to any other commercial terms that are acceptable to both parties. The Australian government really didn't want to be too prescriptive about what is involved in those commercial negotiations, but importantly, it's up to the news media business rather than the digital platform to say when it's time to start formal negotiations under the code and when it's time to go to mediation or arbitration. That's left at the discretion of the news business rather than the digital platform, to reflect the fact that the news business or the publisher is the one that is suffering from the bargaining power imbalance. We could go to slide 13. So, as you might have seen, the code reached Australian Parliament earlier this year. It was introduced in December 2020 and was considered by the Parliament over January and February. If we could go to number 13, please. As our Parliament was considering this new legislation, you might have seen that there was a lot of threats by Facebook and Google. Google initially threatened that if the legislation was passed, it would simply remove its services from Australia altogether. And Facebook actually, during February 2021, removed or blocked all Australian news content on its service. This was quite an intense period for the department and for the Australian government. And it was really a demonstration that both Facebook and Google could wield a huge amount of market power to the extent of threatening governments or threatening whole populations by removing their services or removing certain elements of their services. It's got a lot of coverage internationally, obviously, and on slide 13, we have some examples of some of the headlines around the world. But the Facebook news ban, as we called it, thankfully didn't last long. One of the really interesting things that happened when Facebook decided to remove news content is that they actually cast a very wide net, and they perhaps inadvertently or accidentally removed a lot of other important content, so such as information about COVID vaccinations, or information about fires in Australian regions, which showed the importance of that platform as a communication avenue, and also showed that they weren't very popular when they chose to do that. And eventually, or after 10 days or so, they restored news content on their platform. Following this, the code was, there was some more negotiations between the government and Facebook and Google about the final legislation, and the final legislation was passed on the 25th of February and came into effect on 2nd of March. As mentioned, Google and Facebook have not yet been designated, but following the passage of the legislation, both platforms have struck a number of voluntary deals with Australian publishers. It's been publicly reported that these deals are worth tens of millions of dollars per year, and particularly one of our publishers is Seven West, who publishes the West Australian newspapers and also broadcasts news on the Channel 7 broadcast network. It was reported that their deal is worth $30 million per year, and that's their deal with Google. With Australia having a population of around 25 million people, you could compare that to what an equivalent might be in Argentina, which I think is a population of around 40 million. So we have seen a number of deals come through. We're hoping that there are even more commercial deals that will be negotiated in coming weeks and months. And we've also recently approved, we've recently considered approving collective negotiation by a particular regional group of publishers, and we hope that leads to even more voluntary deals with smaller and regional publications around Australia. The code, now it's in legislation, will be reviewed in 2022 to ensure it remains fit for purpose, and the government and Treasurer will consider whether it's appropriate to designate either Facebook or Google if there aren't enough of these deals. I think that's all I have. Apologies for running a bit over time, but very happy to take any questions people have on the code. Thanks again.
Muchas gracias, David. Antes que nada, quiero agradecerle muchísimo a David, que se ha levantado muy temprano, con las 12 horas de diferencia que tenemos con Australia, así que muchísimas gracias. Clarísimo, muy interesante. En las preguntas que ahora vamos a recorrer, casi que están respondidas en tu presentación. A mí me interesaba hacer muy brevemente hincapié en la sagacidad del código australiano, en plantear una solución binaria, es decir, las plataformas designadas y los medios llevan al mediador o llegan con una propuesta u otra, con dos propuestas. No hay un periodo, después cuando llegan al mediador, no hay un periodo nuevo donde el mediador va justamente a interceder entre las partes, a tratar de llegar a un acuerdo. Allí el mediador va a elegir una solución u otra, con lo cual genera naturalmente un impulso, ese temor, si se quiere, por cuál podría llegar a ser el resultado, de la solución del mediador, es un impulso realmente genial, un método de negociación genial que promueve la buena fe, absolutamente. Así que es destacar esa faceta del código, me parece súper interesante. Vamos rápidamente a unas preguntas. La primera es una reflexión, más que una pregunta, pero seguramente, David, yo tengo mi opinión, pero seguramente vas a poder aportar, porque probablemente haya sido un planteo que han analizado. Dice Rodrigo, muy interesante, pero honestamente no concuerdo con que Google o Facebook deban pagar a los medios por el contenido. A mi entender, es lo mismo que los taxistas y Uber. Se democratiza el acceso y en vez de buscar culpables afuera, somos los medios los que tenemos que buscar adentro la salida. Alianzas, redes, tema de discusión larga y tendida. Es una reflexión interesante. Si quieres hacer algún comentario sobre este planteo, yo tengo una breve respuesta para dar, pero me gustaría escucharte.
Sorry, I missed the first part of that question, but I think you were asking about the difference between our approach and a tax-based approach. Is that right?
El planteo de la primera pregunta es que para Rodrigo, que es quien está preguntando, dice que las plataformas no deberían pagar por el contenido de los medios. Lo asocia, lo asimila a lo que sucede con Uber y los taxis. Como que hay una democratización del acceso a las noticias y que son los medios los que deberían buscar soluciones internamente y no cobrarle a las plataformas por ese contenido.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally understand that. And it is very important that obviously the media sector finds its own ways of being sustainable. There's a lot of debate about our code as well as other approaches overseas. And there's a lot of criticism to say that, well, this is just an example of creative disruption, such as Uber replacing taxis, and people have found a better way to do it. So the legacy media operations should find their own way out, as you say. I think there is an important difference, though. If you look at Uber and taxis, Uber is providing a very similar service to what taxis once did. Whereas here, where we've got a shift in advertising revenue away from journalism to digital platforms, they're providing a similar service to advertisers, but they're not replacing the news content that was once provided by media. So that there's a big difference there. And in Australia, we found that the journalism itself is a public good, and if that's not being replaced by the platforms, there does need to be a solution to that. As I mentioned, this code is only one part of that solution, though. So it's also very important that media businesses look for new avenues of sustainability, as well as there could be other government interventions that doesn't involve platforms, such as direct funding and other mechanisms that we have seen around the world.
Muy brevemente sumo a lo que bien explica David, que creo que se responde con el segundo slide que puse yo, que era la nota de La Nación, en donde se reflejaba el pedido de los artistas, de los compositores musicales, fundamentalmente, bueno, encabezados por Paul McCartney y Noel Gallagher, requiriendo de las plataformas de música o de streaming que les paguen por los contenidos. Acá la gran diferencia, Rodrigo, y lo pongo en Rodrigo, que es quien hizo la pregunta, es que quienes crean los contenidos con un costo enorme que soportan exclusivamente ellos son los medios, y las plataformas aprovechan esos contenidos para hacer negocios, para beneficiarse de manera directa o de manera indirecta, de manera directa con publicidad y con todo este entorno que yo comentaba, donde a través de integraciones verticales desde el punto de vista de la defensa de la competencia, crean todo un entorno donde los medios están obligados a caer y donde afectan decididamente la publicidad, no solo el costo, sino hacia dónde se aloca la publicidad digital. Y de manera indirecta, un dato nada más, es que con las noticias, como bien decía David, Facebook, al pretender cortar sus vínculos con los usuarios australianos, ante la amenaza del código, dejó sin noticias en un momento de pandemia tan importante como el que estamos viviendo a todos sus usuarios. Con lo cual las noticias tienen un grado, aparte, bueno, de tener la libertad de prensa y la libertad de información, rango constitucional en todos los países democráticos. Bueno, no me quiero extender, pero me parece que hay algunas diferencias, pero como bien dice Rodrigo, es un tema de discusión larga y tendida. Te hago una pregunta más, David, abusando un poquito de tu tiempo, y te pedimos disculpas por la extensión. Dice otra persona, hay dos aspectos en la investigación de la Comisión australiana que fueron menos abordados. Por un lado, la opacidad de los algoritmos, que tienen un peso decisivo en el posicionamiento de los medios. Y en definitiva, en su llegada a la audiencia. Y por el otro, el peso que tienen las plataformas en el mercado publicitario y la publicidad de abusos, conflictos de intereses, exclusión de competidores y dumping. ¿Qué medidas se están tomando al respecto desde la Comisión?
Sure. On the second issue, it's clearly a very important issue, the lack of transparency and the conflict of interest in online advertising, particularly on the Google side, in terms of ad tech and what we call the ad tech supply chain, where you have Google often acting as both on behalf of both the purchaser and the publisher of advertising. We're looking at that specifically through a separate inquiry called our ad tech inquiry that released a preliminary report earlier this year, and we're due to publish our final report of that inquiry later on in this year. I must admit, I'm not an expert in ad tech matters. It's extremely complicated, but we have a whole team looking at those issues. And I can certainly pass on the details of what we've published so far and link you to where we're going with that issue. But we expect to make some recommendations to government by the end of the year, specifically on ad tech. On the issue of algorithms, I think one of the big problems with that is the lack of accountability for platforms in how they display content, and particularly the quality of the content in terms of misinformation and disinformation that is particularly available on Facebook, but also on Google as well to an extent. The Australian government is also looking at that issue, and we have recently introduced a voluntary code of conduct for platforms that's being administered by our media regulator, the ACMA. That voluntary code of conduct was published, I think, in February this year, and we're going to be paying a lot of close attention to how that works and what kind of impact that makes on the state of disinformation and misinformation in Australia, and if any further action needs to be taken following that voluntary code.
Gracias, David. Nicolás pregunta, creo que vamos a hacer dos preguntas más, si tenés tiempo, ¿puede ser?
Sure.
Perfecto. Nicolás, primero te agradece la exposición y pregunta, le gustaría saber si el código sufrió cambios luego que Facebook bloqueara temporalmente el acceso a las noticias. Y en caso afirmativo, ¿cuáles fueron esos cambios?
Sure, I'm not sure if it was exactly after Facebook blocked access to news, but our government did introduce some changes on the basis of negotiations with Facebook around the same time. The two biggest changes were firstly the introduction of mediation in the process between negotiation and arbitration. So previously there had been a mediation mechanism, but it was more of a voluntary mechanism if the parties wanted to go to mediation. Facebook wanted that mediation to be mandatory, so I suppose they wanted another chance to sort out the issue before going to arbitration, which the Australian government thought was fine. The other big change was the introduction of the criterion I spoke about earlier. When the Treasurer considers whether to designate a digital platform, the Treasurer will look at the contributions that the platform has made to the sustainability of journalism. That wasn't in the legislation before. We didn't see that as too big a change because we thought that was kind of implicit in the Treasurer's decision-making before, but that criteria was made explicit in the legislation following negotiations with Facebook.
Y una última de Lucía, que dice, ¿y qué sucede cuando otros medios se sirven del contenido generado por un medio determinado y puesto en las redes? No sé si el código... Sí, claro. Lucía pregunta, ¿qué sucede cuando otros medios se sirven del contenido generado por un medio determinado y puesto en las redes? Yo no tengo claro si el código se encargó de este tema, revisó este tema y lo trató, pero bueno, sería interesante tener tu opinión, David.
Sure. That is a very tricky issue, and it's one we talked to a lot of news publishers about, and there was a wide range of views, obviously, on what should be done. It's a really difficult one for governments to deal with specifically because it's probably not best practice for governments to be going in and saying what media should or shouldn't publish. As I mentioned before, you want a lot of independence from government by the media. However, it is something we did include some detail in the code about. So as part of the minimum standards I mentioned before, the code requires designated platforms to make and publish a plan for how they will reward original content through their algorithms. So if they see a news business has published something that isn't taken from other sources, it's new reporting, that should be given appropriate weight through their algorithms and potentially come up higher in Google search or on Facebook newsfeed. This is something that both platforms have said they're interested in doing voluntarily, and it's something we're very interested in them doing. And I would encourage publishers to keep talking to the platforms about it, to find mechanisms to reward original content, although it's something that is probably technically quite difficult to do because you have to identify what is original content. Obviously, some stories pick up elements of other stories and add new reporting as well. So it's not exactly cut and dried what is new and what is a copy. There's a lot in between as well as stories evolve. So yeah, very interesting and tricky issue.
Es muy interesante que el código lo trate, aunque sea de manera tangencial, pero que tenga alguna apostilla sobre el tema. Eso es muy, muy interesante. David, me parece que hemos recorrido de manera incipiente lo que sucede en varios países del mundo y de manera muy concreta y profunda cómo Australia ha dado solución, o por lo menos ha propuesto una solución que está teniendo mucho éxito y que de hecho está siendo copiado por otros países en Europa fundamentalmente. Así que no sé si querés cerrar la charla de alguna manera. Nosotros te agradecemos realmente muchísimo tu esfuerzo y la presentación y la claridad con que lo has dicho y lo has hecho. Y bueno, esperamos tener otras reuniones de este tipo, otras charlas en las cuales poder hacer el seguimiento de cómo estas prácticas y esta normativa y estas propuestas de solución a un tema súper complejo va teniendo en el tiempo. Así que te agradecemos muchísimo y te dejo el cierre para vos.
Thanks very much. Once again, I would just like to say I appreciated the invitation. It's always fun and interesting to talk about this subject matter particularly with publishers who understand some of the nuances. And I'd like to say thanks very much to Diego, to Andres, and Paulina for interpreting. I hope you have a successful rest of the conference. Thank you.